Good afternoon. Well, this is the beginning of a fly tying session that we are going to have this December, and this is going to be a fly tying session that is devoted to methods for tying abdomens of various types of mayflies. And when I say various types, I mean various forms of mayflies, which include, of course, the nymphal form, the wet fly, as well as the dry fly forms of a mayfly. So that will be the focus of this instructional video. And hopefully this video will provide not only a novice, but as well as somebody that's more advanced in tying flies, to understand the stages of the development of a mayfly and how we imitate those mayflies, particularly how we tie in the abdomen of the fly. So you might ask, well, why is it important? Or what are the stages that we are talking about today as far as a mayfly is in its maturation? So let's start off with the very basic form, the nymph. And that is the form of the mayfly that exists on the bottom of a stream, a pond, a river, any aquatic source that the mayflies would inhabit. And the very first phase in the development beyond the egg, so to speak, which is laid by an adult, but I'm starting with the nymphal form, and that is the form of the mayfly that could either be burrowing, could be attached or clinging to rocks, or could be a swimming form of mayfly. And there are different genera, so to speak, classifications of mayfly that are based upon whether the mayfly's very first stage is that of a clinging mayfly, a burrowing mayfly, or a swimming mayfly. So with that said, the second stage of development after the nymph has grown to the point where it's ready to hatch, and it's that time of the year. And by the way, mayflies hatch not just in May. They begin to hatch in early spring, and they're still hatching at different versions of them or different genera all the way through to the fall. And some mayflies will have several hatches or cycles of hatch during the summer, during the warmer months, and some will have a very narrow period of time that they hatch. And so it may be just a few days. And so, for example, in Pennsylvania, when there's something like the yellow sallies or something like that hatching, it may be just for a few days. But on the other hand, a blue wing olive, you might have a hatch 3 times in the warmer months. So that's enough said about that. So I've already covered the various stages, and that would be the nymph, the wet fly, where the nymph is merging towards the surface, and finally the dry fly, where the mayfly has broken through the surface film and it is drying its wings on the surface. And it takes perhaps a few seconds to maybe a minute for that mature mayfly that has broken through the surface to dry its wings before it's able to fly off. And so consequently, I'm going to explain why is it important that you are able to distinguish these different types and also be able to tie the different forms of the mayfly. So let's say that you're fishing a turbulent stream, and it's maybe early spring, maybe it's even late spring, but nonetheless it's fast-moving water, and you don't see any flies coming off the surface of the water. You don't see any on some of the shrubbery that's near the edge of the stream. So you conclude, well, I guess if there's any mayflies, they're going to be nymphs, or there might be wet flies. So in that case, you want to turn over some rocks and look for some nymphs, and then try to pick the size and the sort of the shape, the characteristics of it, in order to replicate that in your nymph, from your fly box, in using that nymph. On the other hand, let's suppose that you do see some activity, but it's not on the surface. And it's fish that are sort of swirling but not breaking the surface. Well, it could be that there is a hatch that is developing, but the fly, as it's hatching, so to speak, or developing, is subsurface. And you'll be able to tell this by whether the fish is porpoising. In other words, you see its tail, or you see the fin on its back as it breaks the water, which indicates the fish are taking this insect beneath the surface or right beneath the surface. And so that's when you would want to fish a wet fly. However, if it's on a still stream where there's a lot of clear surface, and you see the fish coming up and gulping at it or slashing at the surface, you will know that that is a mature insect, particularly because the fish are opening their mouths at the surface to engulf the insect rather than taking it below. So that's why it's important that you're able to distinguish what type of rise form you have, and also able to develop a knowledge or an understanding of what type of fly you want to fish with. And you might fish with what we call a dropper, in which case the lead fly is a dry fly and the subsurface fly is a wet fly, either the same type or maybe a different one. Or you might want to use a two-fly system, in which you have one fly that's subsurface, like a wet fly, and then the bottom, or the dropper, so to speak, is a nymph. And you're using maybe a float indicator, or a strike indicator, or just watching the line for movement as you fish this two-fly rig. So I'm telling you a little bit about the circumstances by which you would use these different forms of a mayfly. Now, before I go any further, let's talk a little bit about that life cycle that I've already alluded to. And in doing so, I'm going to describe for you, because I have some illustrations here of a nymph, a wet fly, and a dry fly. So first of all, and I hope that this is relatively easy to see, but the first fly that I'm pointing to is a nymph. And this is probably a relatively good representation of a gold-ribbed hare's-ear, though you can't see the gold ribbing in it. But nonetheless, there is a very fine gold wire that's wrapped around the abdomen fly. But I hope that you can see, and I'll hold it a little bit closer to the camera, how robust this this dubbing is on this fly. It protrudes not only from the abdomen, but also from the thorax. The next fly I'm going to show you would be a wet fly. And notice in this case, the wing is sloped back. It does have a rather robust abdomen, and it has a relatively short tail. And in the last case, we have a dry fly with wings, and this is, by the way, a light Cahill dry fly, and a very fine abdomen as compared to the more robust nymph wet fly and the nymph form. And it has a very fine tail, which is generally tied the same length as the shank of the hook. So these are the three representations that we're going to be tying in this session, but we're going to be focusing on how to tie that abdomen for each of the three flies, and not focusing on wings and other parts of the fly. So when we begin this session, when we're actually doing the tying, we'll start off with the dry fly, because it's the easiest type to tie in terms of the abdomen. And for both that one and the wet fly, we will be using a conventional method of twisting the dubbing counterclockwise in that direction, counterclockwise around the tying thread. In contrast to that standard method, for the nymph, we will be dubbing the thread using a simple dubbing loop. And the terminology, a dubbing loop, comes from the fact that you create a loop in your thread, And inside that loop, or within the interior of that loop, you insert pieces of dubbing. You can insert other types of things, such as peacock curl, a mixture of hairs, whatever, in the construction. That can be so very simple to very, very complicated and sort of eloquent, you might use that term, in developing that dubbing loop. But the focus of a dubbing loop is to give you a nice, robust, or I refer to the word rotund, meaning a bulky type of an abdomen, and it's done relatively easy by twisting the thread in one direction, generally counterclockwise, as I mentioned before, after you've inserted this material into the dubbing loop. Now, let's talk a little bit about types of dubbing. Well, dry fly dubbing is generally fine. Many times it's made out of beaver because beavers have no guard hairs. The guard hairs that's in the fur of an animal is basically to prevent, and it's generally in mammal hair, everything from your cat and dogs to woodchucks and raccoons or whatever, all have guard hairs, which protects the animal's skin or surface of the animal from abrasion. A beaver doesn't have to deal with that, so beaver fur is relatively fine, and also it's very buoyant because beavers swim. Okay, so that's going to be the first type of dubbing that I'm going to show you, is some relatively fine, in this particular case, beaver dubbing. And I'll pull out a little bit so that you can see its fine structure. I'll just show you a little bit, and it comes in various colors, from really dark, which we'd use for maybe a dark caddisfly or something like that, gray for something like a muskrat nymph, something perhaps like this in cinnamon or reddish brown, which would be used for tying an Isonychia type of mayfly. Some of these others, light one here, such as this would be maybe a sulfur here, and maybe light cahill here, or a cinnamon caddis, and so on. But I hope you can see that this is relatively fine. It's pure. It's not bulky, but they do come in a variety of colors. Now, so that's an illustration of dry fly dubbing. Then we can be talking, the next thing we can talk about would be the type of dubbing that's used for tying the nymphs and for the wet flies. And this in general, and I'm just using this as an example, this is a box that is, it contains Whitlock's dubbing blend. So it's a blend of dubbing, and the blend refers to the fact that not only is the hair a blend of different colors, but it's also a blend of antron that I mentioned perhaps a little bit earlier. Antron being a synthetic fiber that was first used by Gary LaFontaine in many of his caddisfly patterns, because antron has a three-sided fiber that's a synthetic fiber, which tends to glisten underwater, and in Gary's words, would imitate the air bubbles that an insect uses to rise to the surface. But nonetheless, it makes it a lot easier for the fish to see that, and probably imitates the fly a little bit closer. So in this particular box, I have all wet fly or nymph dubbing. It is, again, as I said, much coarser, and because it has guard hairs in it, as well as in this particular box, these are all antron. So these would be referred to as either antron type dubbings or hairtron, because rabbit's hair containing antron. Okay, so with that explained, then let's begin to get on to tying. And the first thing we will start off is by tying a dry fly. All right. Well, we're going to start today. Again, the purpose of this, or the focus of this class, is to teach fly tiers some of the basics of tying the abdomen. And so perhaps the easiest abdomen to tie on a fly is that of a dry fly. So to sort of move things along, I've already inserted the hook in the vise, and I have put a pair of wings on this dry fly that we'll be tying. And so I'm going to be picking up as I go on from this point with putting in a tail and then dubbing the abdomen. So let's get started. I have selected a piece of neck hackle that's going to be the tail for this fly. And so I'm going to remove, bend this a little bit in a curvature of the feather, and I grasp a few of these fibers and I pull them off as such. In that case, they're all lined up and they're basically the same length. So I'm going to measure the tail of this fly to be equivalent to the length of the shank of the hook. And then I just clip off a little bit of this extra that's not necessary. I lay this on the top of the hook, but sort of to my side of the fly. And that will allow the first couple thread wraps to pull that tail right up on top and line it up with the shank of the hook. Now I'm wrapping my thread back to the bend of the hook and then making just a few wraps forward to bring the thread approximately to the point of the hook. And that's where I'm going to start my dubbing. And so for this fly, which is again a dry fly, I'm going to be using some beaver dubbing. And this is from the Hook and Hackle Company, but that's not important where it came from. And so I'm going to pull off a little bit of this, and I hope that you can see in the camera, this is relatively fine material, and there's no guard hairs in it. And so it's relatively easy to dub this type of dubbing onto the thread. So I'm going to do that. And remember that what I do is I moisten my fingers a little bit because I'm not in favor of putting wax on the thread for this type of dubbing. So I'm holding the a bobbin in my left hand just over my fingers. I'm taking a little bit of this dubbing and I'm putting it on the thread in a counterclockwise direction to build up sort of a noodle. And this so-called noodle is about an inch and a half long. And that may be even a little bit more than I need. I've tightened it down with my thumb and forefinger, both at the beginning and at the end of this noodle. And now I slide that up the thread, stopping about 1/8 of an inch in back or at beyond where the thread intersects the abdomen of the fly. So I make a few wraps backwards to bring that thin part right back to where I had tied in the tail, and then I begin to wrap forward. And remember that in a dry fly, the dry fly has emerged, and so it has a thin abdomen. It has eliminated its shucks, it has pulled its wings out, and so now the abdomen is relatively thin. And as you can hopefully see from the camera, this dubbing or this dubbed abdomen is tapered. It's very thin back at the tail, and it builds up with a little bit of bulk as it proceeds up to the where I have the wing in place. So I can make one wrap with a little bit of dub thread in front there to hold it. And we would normally at this point tie in the wings of this fly, but since the point of this session is learning how to dub abdomens, I'm going to stop here because this is all it takes to insert the tail and dub the abdomen of a dry fly. So I'm going to whip finish this and then set this aside, and we'll go on to our next type of fly that we're going to do abdomens on, and that'll be a wet fly. So we'll finish that a little bit. I'll clip this off and set this this fly aside, and it could be finished a little bit later. So Now what I'm going to do before I move on any further is show you a completed dry fly so that you can see the similarity between the two. This one is probably a light Cahill, and that's what I was trying to simulate with the fly that I just was tying. You can see it has a very fine tail that's very, very straight, because that helps keep the fly up off the water. In a dry fly, the conventional dry fly, there's 3 points of contact with the water: the hackle, the tip of the hook, and the tip of the tail. And that's what keeps the fly buoyed up on top of the water in the case of a classic dry fly. So we're going to move on from here, but I did want to show you the similarity between one that is completely tied and one which I just tied at this point. All right, well, now we're going to tie a classic wet fly, and the one that I chose is probably commonly known as light Cahill. Light Cahills hatch generally in the spring of the year. A dark Cahill generally hatches first, probably in the March, April time frame, and then as we move into the warmer weather, there will be a lighter version of that called the light Cahill. So I'm going to be tying basically just my representation of that fly. I have intentionally left the tail off of this fly, although we normally would insert the tail on a wet fly. But since we're focusing on the abdomens, I'm going to concentrate on that, and I'm not going to put in a tail on this particular version. So I will start my thread in the standard manner, just behind the eye of the hook, and wrap it back to the bend of the hook, at which point I'll clip off the excess thread. And then I have a small section of wire, gold wire. You can use gold or copper, which is going to provide some segmentation to the fly. And I'm going to tie that in, first of all, by laying that wire on the far side of the hook and making a few thread wraps. It's going to bring my, my thread back to the bend of the hook. And now I have tied in that gold or copper wire, which is going to provide some sort of segmentation. And the reason I've chose to do that on this particular wet fly is that not only does it look like the fly's abdomen, which is a segmented part of the body of the fly, but it also gives a little bit of glistening that the fish might key on, and it provides sort of a basis to hold that dubbing in place. Now, the dubbing that I've selected for this particular fly is March Brown, and again, this is Ligas dubbing that I purchased from this container from the Hook and Hackle company. So I've already pulled out a little bit, and I would like to note that in comparison to the beaver dubbing, which was used for the dry fly, this dubbing has guard hairs in it. And so it's going to be a little bit more coarse. And this is probably from a rabbit rather than from a beaver. So I'm taking a section of this in my left hand and laying the thread over my fingers as I did in the previous fly. Moisten my fingers a little bit and begin to twist that on. And this is a little bit more difficult. You need to use a little bit more pressure because the guard hairs hold this dubbing sort of off of the thread in comparison with the beaver dubbing, which was pure in the sense that it didn't have any guard hairs in. Again, I've created a noodle, so to speak, of dubbing onto the thread, and it may not be evident, and I've had people ask me, well, how much pressure are you putting on to the twisting the dubbing? It's one of those things that you have to get a feel for, but I do exert a considerable amount of pressure between my thumb and my finger as I'm twisting it counterclockwise. So I pull this dubbing, as I did in the previous fly, up towards the end of the thread so that I have maybe not quite 1/4 of an inch, and I begin to that wrap just about where the point of the hook is, make my first couple wraps back towards the bend of the hook, stopping just about where the barb is or where I would have tied in the tail. And now I begin to come forward, building up a football shape, an extended football shape. And as I hope you can see, it has a little bit of a spikiness to it. Now, you might find this happening, that some of your dubbing will come a little bit loose as you're turning. So there's no harm in just tightening that up before you go any further. And I hope that you can see that this abdomen is a little bit heavier in the middle. It's tapered here, it's tapered here. But I'm going to put a little bit more on because I want to build that abdomen to go a little bit further forward, because that's where we'll be putting in the wing on this wet fly. So a little bit more dubbing on the thread. Put it on basically the same way, pinching it at the beginning and at the end, leaving the thicker part of the dubbing right in the middle. And that allows us to build up a little bit more bulk. And again, I can twist that on, make it a little bit tighter. All right. So, I'm just finishing that off right at the front of the fly. Now, for just the sake of that things don't come unraveled, what I'm going to do is put in a half hitch right here to hold the thread in place. Because the next thing I'm going to do is wrap that wire. And so I'm putting my thread bobbin over the bobbin holder, and then I can either, if you have a rotary vise, you can turn the vise to apply the, to palmer the gold wire forward, or you can do it by hand. So I'll just illustrate to start that I'm going to do it with the rotary vise. You can see that this way you can watch that you're segmenting the fly body, or as I mentioned before, I can do it by hand, wrapping it around a stationary vise till I get it up to the front. And now I will take 2 thread wraps behind the wire and 2 thread wraps in front, or 3, whatever. I always do a minimum of 2, and then I'll use my wire snippers to snip that off. Of course, if you don't have a pair of wire snippers, you can always parachute it, and that is twisting the wire back and forth until it breaks off. So the only thing that remains to be done on this particular fly is to put in a wing. And so I've chosen a piece of wood duck feathers, and I stroke that back until I have a number of fibers just about the length of the shank of the hook. I measure that, holding it by my right hand, and then I transfer this to my left hand. I'm going to clip off this extra. It makes it a little bit easier to not have to deal with that. So I've already made that measurement. I'll show you again that I have this wing just going back to the bend of the hook. Again, I grasp it with my left hand. I bring the thread up and use a pinch wrap. Pinch wrap meaning you put it between your thumb and your forefinger. One wrap around, another wrap around, and then pull up. And by pulling up, you apply the pressure directly down on top. If I were to pull down, I'm pulling the fibers around to the far side. So now I can just wrap that forward a few strokes, pick up this excess and clip it off, and a few more thread wraps. And then you can either whip finish it or half hitch it. So in this particular case, I just use my whip finisher. Clip it off, And we now have a K-heel. But before I finish that, I'm going to use a tool that I made, and I'll stroke out some of these fibers to make this a little bit bushier. So what I have created here is I took the insert of a ballpoint pen, crushed the two ends of it. Of course, it didn't have any ink in it. And then I fastened a piece of soft material at one end, and sort of like Velcro, and then something a little bit coarser in terms of a heavy fiber material on the other end. So I use that end to stroke out some of this dubbing, because we want, remember, this fly is emerging to the surface and it still has some air bubbles trapped in that hair. It still has that bulky appearance, and so we're just making this a little bit bulkier. It hopefully is going to be more appeasing to the fish. So there we have finished a K-heel wet fly. All right, the third fly that we're going to tie is going to be a nymph. And in this particular case, I'm going to deviate from the standard way of dubbing the thread, which I used for the previous two flies, for the dry fly and for the wet fly. And we're going to be using what's called a dubbing loop. And it goes probably under other names, but most commonly it's referred to as the dubbing loop. And I'm going to explain the basis of a dubbing loop as I'm tying this fly. But the first thing I'm going to be doing is laying down my thread and inserting the tail, and then we'll get to the dubbing loop. So we're going to start wrapping as usual behind the eye of the hook and wrapping back to the bend, stopping just about above the barb of the hook, clipping off the extra thread. And now I've taken a little bit of this partridge feather, and this is basically partridge flank feather, and you need very little for a tail on a nymph. And in this particular case, I'm going to, and I'll show you how I remove it. And it's not going to be tied in as long as you would do on a dry fly. Dry fly, it should be the length of the shank of the hook. A wet fly, it should be a little bit shorter, but on a nymph, it's going to be relatively short. So I again take some of the fibers that's sticking out from the side, and I just hold this in my left hand and pull on that, and I get more than enough fibers that's going to be the tail. So I hope that you can see that. What I'm going to do is, again, make a measurement using the shank of the hook, and I'm only going to have this sticking out about half the length of the shank of the hook. Again, I will hold these fibers along my side of the hook and bring the thread up over them, and as I pull, it will bring the feather fibers right up on top. So if you're not happy with that, you know, it's very easy to take it off. But for right now, I think we'll go with that. In fact, I might even make it a little bit shorter while I'm at it. Okay, there we go. Now I can clip off this extra and make my wraps just to make that material very secure. Notice where I'm stopping my thread. I'm stopping it just about at the point of the hook rather than back at the barb of the hook, because now I'm going to create what's called a dubbing loop. I take my two fingers, my index and middle finger, and I lay that on top of the thread, and I make a loop around it and around the shank of the hook, one wrap. And then I come across to close that loop, and then I pull it forward. So I have secured that loop, and it's probably not easy to see without having something on the thread, but believe me, there is a loop here around my two fingers and back. I'm going to bring this thread forward so it gets out of the way. and just let my bobbin hang. The next thing I will do is take this tool. I will show you this as well as what we call a dubbing. I refer to it as a spinner, or it has some other names, but nonetheless, the point of these is to keep your thread open while you're applying some dubbing into the loop itself. So I guess that came apart, so I need to reinsert that. Into the dubbing loop. I think you'll see the rationale for using this type of thing very shortly, because we need to keep that loop open while we are inserting the material that we're going to be using. And that material is going to be some of this. It's Whitlock's dubbing, and I like this. This was developed probably by Dave Whitlock, at least it's carrying his name. It has some antron fibers in it. It's very coarse, like the dubbing was for the last fly, for the wet fly, but this also has these antron fibers in there, which is going to give somewhat of glistening to the abdomen of the fly, probably representing the air bubbles that's used as the nymph begins to emerge towards the surface of the stream. But the other thing I'm going to be doing, which I didn't do for the wet fly, is I'm going to add a little bit of dubbing wax to one of the strands of the thread. Now, I'm going to give you a little tip on how to use dubbing wax. First of all, you don't want very much of it exposed at the very top of the tube of dubbing wax, because it'll just make clumps. And you put it on just by making one stroke. You don't want to go back and forth, because again, you're going to get too much dubbing. All this is going to do is provide a little bit of tackiness to that part of the thread, so that the dubbing, as we apply it, is going to stick to that until we spin it closed. So I'm now taking some of the dubbing that I showed you just a moment ago, and I'm slipping it in between those two strands of that dubbing loop. So I have some in there now. I'll put a little bit more in. Now I should have about enough there. And note that as I pull this small device towards me, which is sort of Y-shaped if you weren't able to see that, the loop begins to close, and it basically traps it traps the fibers that I had right inside of the loop. Okay, and now I'm going to take another clip, and I'm going to insert that in there just so that I have a hold on that thread after I remove this tool. Okay, and now I can begin to twist this thread to create a long noodle, so to speak, that has the dubbing fibers sticking out both sides. When this is applied then to the fly, it's going to give a very buggy appearance. Now I'm just going to let that set for a moment while I put a half hitch in to secure my thread. And then I can pull that out of the way. Now notice as I begin to turn this rotary vise, or I'll do it by hand also, I'm going to be making my first couple turns so that this dubbing loop is going to go all the way back to the starting point of the abdomen. That it would be just at the beginning of the bend of the hook. And that's where my first dubbing is going to intersect the abdomen of the fly. And now I'll begin to go forward And I hope that you can see that I'm building up a very bulky body, or very bulky abdomen on this fly. And everything is very coarse with a lot of spikiness sticking out. Now, I could have done this in a conventional manner, but the beauty of a dubbing loop is that you can incorporate other materials, you can incorporate mixes of materials, and you don't have to be just doing the old style dubbing of the thread and then trying to pick out the fibers, because this is already very buggy. So now I have enough material laid down. I just hold this sort of dubbing with my left hand, tighten my thread a little bit, come around behind it. I'm going to make 2 wraps around to hold this in place. Switch hands, make 2 wraps in front, and then I can clip off this excess that I don't really need. So I hope that you can see already that there is this is very robust and it looks very buggy, and hopefully if I held that up like so, you might be able to see that a little bit better. All right, so I'm going to stroke this back, because the next thing we're going to do is put in a wing case. And so I've pre-selected some raffia. It goes by other trade names, but you can buy this in a lot of stores where they just sell packing material, wrapping material, because it's very strong as a fiber, but it makes beautiful wing cases because it has a glistening to it. You can get it in different colors. So I've just chosen this piece of brown raffia, and I don't need all of that for a wing case. So I'm going to basically cut this in half, and then take this 1/2 and make a blunt end on it, so that it's almost like a blunt arrowhead. And I'll lay that on with the shiniest side facing down, so that when I curl it, that shiny side, which will look like the wing case, will be facing up. And make a few thread wraps on that, and then I pull it back so that I don't have a piece sticking out, and hold it right on top of the abdomen of the fly. Make a few more thread wraps until I've created a fairly good wing case that'll go over my thorax. So a few more thread wraps, won't hurt. Okay, so now I have the tail, the abdomen, the wing case, and the only thing that's left to do is to build up a little bit of the thorax. So I'm going to take a little bit more of that dubbing that we had before, and I'm going to dub it on to the thread in the conventional way, because I could make another dubbing loop, but it's really almost superfluous at this point. So I'll wet my thumb a little bit, between my thumb and my finger a little bit, and spin on some of that dubbing. Again, always in the counterclockwise direction. As I mentioned before, if you do it in the clockwise direction, then as you're wrapping the dubbing on, it tends to come unraveled. So I just slide that up. You can always slide the dubbing up and down, so don't feel that it's stationed in one place. And I'll make a few wraps going forward towards the eye of the hook, and then come back to build up a little bit of bulk right behind. And I think I could use just a little bit more on there. Okay, bring my thread forward, bring my wing case forward, and hold it down. So my thread is right in place to finish the head of the fly. I just hold this down with my thumb flat on top. Make one loose wrap, pull down, make another, and then lift. We're going to lift this wing case up. That is the piece that's sticking forward, so I can get one wrap underneath. That makes this nice and secure, and it's very easy then to clip off that extra. So I'll turn that so you can see it from the side. Now, before I tease out that dubbing, I want to I'll clip off a few of these little fibers that are sticking out. Do a whip finish. Now the fly is almost finished. I'll return to my little dubbing tool, and I can flip the fly over and brush it out, because it's now going to be creating what would in essence be the legs of this fly as it's maturing at this little nymph, because those legs were folded up to some degree in a nymph prior to this. So it's a pretty good version. I might trim a little bit to get a little bit of symmetry to it, but I want to leave these fibers sticking out so that this looks real boogy. It looks very real, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. I'll do it in this perspective as well as that perspective. So there we have it. That is how to tie a nymph using a dubbing tool, spinning dubbing tool